If you think about all the different types of movies, books, plays, and TV shows that are floating around out there waiting for you to stream or rent or download, for the most part, they can all be distilled down into two genres that Shakespeare perfected: the comedy and the tragedy. These were two of the genres that he used in the writing of his plays. The other is the history genre, but we're not going to be focusing too much on that right now. The reason we need to focus on comedies and tragedies is because they started a tradition that modern storytelling continues. The most basic idea behind this is the fact that no story is driven forward without a conflict. If the basic order of things is never disrupted, we have no story. Shakespeare was a master of using this idea in his stories. We will typically start in a place or time where everything is established and familiar. Now, this might mean that the kingdom is at peace, or the people are friends with one another, or even that certain people have been enemies for a long time, like in the case of Romeo and Juliet. It's not a good situation, but it was the status quo that we entered into the story with. The story or conflict begins when someone tries to disrupt the way things were before. When the result of this disruption is a celebration or understanding or change in the status quo to something better than what the characters had before, that is what we define as a comedy. Essentially, it means that we will have a happy ending, but it will take us on a roller coaster of emotions and tensions to get us there. This is where we get the comedic situations. Indeed, comedy itself can be defined as tragic situations viewed from a distance or with a certain perspective. When we watch a comedy and see a dog get punted off a bridge, or a couple of guys think that their friend has been turned into a toad, these are all examples of suffering. But because we are the audience and we have distance from the situation, and because they are presented in a way that discourages us from sympathizing, we find humor in it. Now, I think that humor can be important for coping with the suffering that we see around us constantly, but that doesn't change that at its core, comedy is all suffering. A story that calls itself a comedy simply finds humor in the suffering and rewards its characters with a happy ending. Here are some elements to be aware of in Shakespeare's comedies. Many times you will see several characters towards the beginning of the story start in a state of turmoil and end up in a state of harmony. Now, this might be a little spoilery when we start reading the play, and you will be able to identify these characters very quickly, but if you really think about it, this is a trademark of modern comedies as well. It's a trope you have already been exposed to in one form or another, and you probably would have been able to recognize it about these characters whether I had given you this piece of information or not. You simply now have a context for it, and you will see how influential Shakespeare's way of doing this has been on modern storytelling. A theme in a Shakespearean comedy can often be expressed as a celebration of life. Characters will try to self-actualize, meaning that they have goals, hopes, and dreams and will try to attain them in whatever form that means for them.
I want adventure in the great wide somewhere.
There's also just an overall good feeling pervading the play and just a general sense of optimism. What happens to characters can also be used as an ethical instructor. In other words, show you how or how not to live your life. There are lessons to be learned from some characters about life and love that you can come across as this is the way to do things, or perhaps as this is what you should definitely not do. You will come away from Shakespearean comedies with all kinds of ethical judgments. You know, saying that that guy was a jerk, or she was so sweet and innocent, or that dude is my hero. Comedies really invite their audiences to connect with certain characters for different reasons. Things will seem to be heading for disaster, but something always happens to make things turn out well, like a eucatastrophe, no matter how much it might just depend on good luck. Some people would call this a cliche, but the main point of a comedy is to subvert suffering for the sake of humor or an uplifting message. Then you have to toe the line of disaster. The characters need an obstacle to rise above and actualize the happy ending, where the suffering of the humor is all put into perspective. You know, something that makes all of the bad situations worth it. Often, Shakespeare made the reality of his comedies malleable or moldable. This means that the door is open for things to happen that would not happen in real life. Sometimes that's obvious when you have something like fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream, or the God of Love at the end of As You Like It. Or sometimes it can play out through silly situations that you might just think are too far-fetched or coincidental to happen in real life. Shakespeare would often have his heroes or heroines cross-dress to get closer to the objects of their affection. One can say that the risk factor is pretty high on that strategy. Yet it happens in comedies, and we buy it because we are entering into a malleable world where we accept those kind of things because we want to experience the story fully. It's no different from accepting that you could somehow win the Mathletes Championship and book it back to your spring fling to accept the crown only to break it apart into pieces in a gesture of social equity while Aaron Samuels forgives all of the drama you have caused over the last several months. I mean, you have to recognize the unlikelihood of that, but it's okay because we're dealing with comedies, and if you didn't get my reference, that's going to make me feel really old.
So fetch.
Characters will often work themselves out of tight spots. This really relates to the last one because the suffering of a short inconvenience is played for the purpose of bringing a character to a satisfying conclusion. Without seeing the hero work their way out of a dangerous situation, we don't sympathize with their eventual triumph. There's no joy in seeing a situation play out perfectly as the characters planned. We want those X-factor moments of risk and teetering on the edge of losing everything. Again, this is for the audience, so we can appreciate the closure at the end more thoroughly. There's an emphasis on song, dance, disguise, turning things upside down, just a general sense of wackiness. This is because it relates to the role that drama played in medieval festivals. But it's certainly a tradition that you see carried on in comedy today. Just think about any parody video on the internet or any SNL or late night TV skit. There's an element of clowning around. This means the characters will act in unusual ways or even act irrationally for the sake of the humor. Again, this is driving more suffering into the narrative so that we can have the payoff of the punchline or happy ending. It's much funnier to observe it when we have ridiculous people on the receiving end of the joke. Manipulation usually plays a major role in comedies. One way to inflict the kind of suffering necessary for a comedic situation is to make the character believe something about themselves or the situation that will drive them to make impulsive, irrational, selfish, or foolish decisions. Sometimes characters will be manipulated into something that others consider to be for their own good, but the comedy comes from the situation either backfiring or having unintended consequences for the characters to deal with. There's typically a fool. This is the character placed in the narrative for seemingly the sole purpose of providing levity and an element of clowning around to the story. They will also use language in a comedic way. We'll talk further about how the fool in the plays that we read will do this, but you can certainly see this in modern day comedies, how language is an easy way to communicate in a way intended to elicit laughter. It's almost to the point where this has become more of an element of comedies today than the happy ending. Finally, in Shakespeare's comedies, closure is often achieved through marriage. We don't have this as much today in modern comedies, but we do see it quite a bit in one form or another, whether or not it's called marriage. And we do see this trend echoed in the fact that resolution between characters will often consist in them coming together, making peace, or moving forward as allies. So even though it's not always done through the practice of marriage, we see this trend continue. Now, tragedy works in many of the same ways that a comedy does. The order of things is upset. We see situations take place that cause suffering for the participants in the story. However, in a tragedy, we see death take center stage. There is now a price for the suffering. It will not be relieved, and we experience it as pure, unadulterated misery. The tragedy demands a sacrifice of the story in a way, and it will not cater to the audience's hopes and whims for a happy resolution. Instead, it asks us to confront the suffering as it is, removes the distance that comedy gave us, and it makes our emotional response coincide with the truth of the futility of some situations. Essentially, tragedy is when the audience is forced to confront suffering. However, we can appreciate tragic stories because they are a safe way to deal with sort of a distilled version of the emotions we feel in the face of real tragedy. That is why they have survived to this day as well. They are our way into the other side of our emotional selves. The biggest characteristic of this genre is the tragic hero. We still have a character or two that we as the audience want to see succeed, one we identify with, one whose troubles or situation we want to empathize with, but we can't ever fully do this because they have a fatal flaw. This is part of their personality that they cannot overcome, and it leads to their eventual downfall. Every Shakespearean tragic hero has this, a vice they can't overcome or a personality trait that's manipulated. They will also succumb easily to external pressures and will balk at opportunities to do right either by themselves or the people around them. Often we'll view these plays and say to ourselves, why don't they just do it this way? We may think that we have a better perspective on their situation. But remember, it's very easy to say this when you're not in that situation yourself, but watching it as the audience, and this character has that fatal flaw that prevents them from having a clear perspective. Just like a comedy, things will begin in order and be thrust into some sort of chaos. In a comedy, this will happen so that the pieces can be gathered up again and reassembled into something fantastic. But in a tragedy, we are going to end with a giant mess that can't be cleaned up. The ramifications of a hero's choices will remain, and everyone will be affected by it. and will inevitably have to contend with it in their own minds as well. The environment in the story will oftentimes change to reflect the course of events. Sometimes this will be the weather, storms will begin to roll in, or perhaps some specific element of physical darkness will enter the narrative. Either way, the environment will reflect the story itself. We will start feeling that we should expect something bad based on the surroundings. We, as the audience, will have sympathy for this tragic fallen hero. We need to for the tragedy to be effective, and I can prove it. If we think the tragic hero is actually a despicable character who we can't relate to at all, and we think deserves to be smited by the heavens, we will create distance between us and that character's suffering. And what happens when we create distance between the audience and suffering? If I have to tell you by now, restart the video. For us to be sympathetic with the character, we have to connect with them. The writer therefore needs to create a hero or heroine deserving of sympathy, or else they will have unintentionally created a comedy. Dramatic irony is a huge part of giving the audience a very close experience with the tragedy. If the author can give the audience information that the characters do not know, it really hits home when the tragic hero does something we could have saved them from. In effect, it cuts the audience off from the object of our sympathy, therefore heightening the tragic elements of the story until death. In a tragedy, we will experience the death of the protagonist. It's the only fitting ending that accomplishes the goal of the tragedy. In contrast to comedies, the celebration of life, here we have the experience of death, thereby confronting us, the audience, with the ultimate result of suffering. And this time, there's nothing funny about it. We have to drink from that cup. Comedies and tragedies of today don't exist without the elements that Shakespeare introduced to these genres. As we take a look at examples of these genres, it will become extremely clear that every romantic comedy can be traced back to a structure that Shakespeare really perfected. And in a lot of dramatic stories, you can see these elements of the tragedy as well. It's just another example of Shakespeare's overwhelming influence on storytelling today.